Good morning, dear friends. Guten Erev Shabbos. It is Friday, February 25th. Adar 1, the first Adar 24, Chaf Dalid. We're gathered here to study the entire Talmud, one page, one line at a time. At this moment, we are studying Masechet Shabbos, and we have just made a siyum on chapter Yud Beis, the 12th chapter, and we are entering the Bar Mitzvah chapter, Perek Yud Gimel, chapter known as Perek HaOreg, the chapter that begins this with a discussion about weaving. It's not as daunting as it may sound, and we have some backup imagery we're going to start in a moment. But before we do that, I'd like to share, well, of course, we dedicate our learning for the welfare and well-being of our dear brothers and sisters across the globe, and particularly in areas of conflict. They should be protected and safe, and we should have shalom overall. And of course, sending prayerful wishes for the well-being of our dear members of our Chabur and their households. Before we go into the new chapter, well, we started, but we'll do that in a moment. I want to share the screen. And I would like to just take a fast glance at the previous Gemara. We spoke about Notariko, and I don't want to relitigate that, but I do want to take a look at specifically the discussion about Anochi.
Rabbi.
Yes.
You have to change your introduction that we're studying one letter at a time.
But we value every letter, but we are still there. Okay. So the word Anochi is a notarikon or notrikon. And it stands for, there are a few different versions, but we started with Ana Nafshi, Kitavit Yavit, I myself wrote it and gave it, or others say, I put myself, Ana Nafshi Kitavit, I put my soul, my being into the Torah and gave it. So he says the letters of Anochi correspond to the letters, the parts of the soul. So when he's here, let's see if I can make sense of this. No, actually, no, it's not what I thought I was saying. Another moment. Okay, I was looking for something else. And this we did already. But I think we're gonna be ready to start the new Gemara. Let's do that. Let's start the Bar Mitzvah chapter, Perek Yud Gimel, and for our convenience, can you see the additional window I'm opening now? Can you see the images?
No.
Okay. So then I have to adjust my settings. Hold on a second. Hold on. Let me see. All right, now I'm sharing my screen. Here we go. Here's the new chapter. Good Shabbos, dear doctor. Thank you. All right. So as you may recall, we have been on the march elaborating and explaining different avot, milacha, we're going through a variety of the 39 prohibited primary categories on Shabbos. We just finished a lengthy discussion about the parameters, the definitions of kosev, certainly broadened our mind and forced us to consider generally how much Judaism and the Torah values writing, its ability to convey deep meaning with even the slightest letter. We know, and again, I know we're closing this out, we know that in the Torah, even a single added letter can be teaching us vast halachot. And so on Shabbos, 2 letters, generally speaking, one is liable, it's considered a malacha. And we're now going to proceed to the next malacha, which is ha'oreg, which is weaving. Now, as you may recall, last time we started a new chapter, which was Perek Haboneh. We asked the question in the order of the 39 malachas, why do we proceed with instruction? We should have gone to another. And the Gemara explains or not the Gemara, I'm sorry. We looked at one of the commentaries on the Mishnayos that explained that it was a necessary chronology because whatever the answer was that we give. And so similarly here, it appears that we're jumping around to go from Kotev to Oreg. If we were following the chronological order, it would have been reasonable to proceed with the processes of producing hide to produce leather, which would be the next step after Kotev. But if you recall, we keep on lumping together writing and weaving because they are both similar in that they are the number two letters and two strings, two strands. And so that is according to an explanation about why we immediately proceed to discuss Oreg, to discuss weaving. Now let's take a look and we'll use this beautiful illustration in a moment to try to imagine and to understand what's going on over here. So here we go. Well, hold on. Before we start, anyone here have experience in the art of weaving? Anyone here? Okay, no. And by the way, I don't think weaving is the same as knitting, although I guess conceivably it is, but it's not really what we're talking about. Okay, let's get started. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Rabbi Eliezer teaches ha'oreg, when one weaves, which is a prohibited act on Shabbos. And if you notice, the name of the chapter we say is ha'oreg. Shalosh hachutim, if one weaves 3 threads, 3 strings, batchila, when starting out a new product, a new garment, Rashi, Rabbi Lazar, also the frushi shiur oreg shamano bavot melachot. Our goal here, our objective of this Mishnah is to define the shiur, the amount of weaving that is prohibited under the prohibition of oreg. The Tanan Hasam Shnei Chutim, as indeed we've already mentioned earlier on in the Gemara that weaving is 2 strands. Again, just for our clarity here, this is the Mishnah that discusses the 39 Malaches, and it states over here, ha'oreg shnei chotim, if you weave 2 strands, etc. So this is the malacha as it's listed in the Mishnah. And now we're going to see a Mishnah which elaborates on this. Rabbi Lazar says the prohibition is actually 3 chotim, 3 strings. Rashi, im zu tchilas arisas arigase shel beged. As you know, a garment is comprised of a large number of threads. How many? I don't know. A lot. But every garment, every work process, every labor begins with the first step. Every home has the first brick. Okay, maybe not, and so every garment has the first string, thread. And so Rabbi Lazar says that in the initial start of a garment, you would have to be weaving 3 threads. The achas al ha'arig, Rashi, but if he is adding to a pre-existing garment, then 1 string is already substantial. As Rashi says, the mitzar from Ashar, it combines and fuses with the additional threads that are already placed. So to be chayev, according to Rabbi Lazar, it depends. At the outset, to make this garment, to start it off, you have to do 3. Then it's considered chashuv. But if you're just adding to a pre-existing garment, 1 string alone would make 1 chayev. The Chachamim disagree and say no. There is, a single formula, bein betchila, bein besoif, regardless of where you are in the creation process. Shi'uroi shnei chotim. Weaving is a problem if you contribute 2 strands of material. So let's take a look. Again, with the caveat that I'm certainly not an expert in weaving. But what I understand is as follows. We have what we call the vertical and horizontal strings. In Hebrew, shesi ve'erev. And generally speaking, you have set up the vertical strings in a loom, which is a technique, which is a mechanism that can somehow move up and down the string so as to ensure that it is being woven in between the different threads. And so you have this mechanism, and then one would thread through the horizontal threads. So here's the beginning of the garment. You have a loom. I suspect this is a somewhat primitive portrayal, which is helpful for our purposes. And so you have here a single first string. This would be the beginning of the process. And then you weave it around to be two. Here it's not portrayed as separate strings, but a separate row of weaving. And the Chachamim say you are always chayiv, no matter if it's here or if it's deep into the creation of the garment. Here is 3 threads. And if you'll notice, to be considered to be on the way, it makes sense that you'd have to do an extra string to be considered at the start of a garment. Rabbi Elazar says, once you have a whole garment, 1 extra string is substantive enough to make a person chayiv. So here we can kind of visualize, at least according to this illustrator, how it would have looked. We're talking about introducing the horizontal threads to the vertical threads, which are laid out or set up in a loom, in a weaving. Dr. Hammer, you're muted, but please.
My question quickly is there a difference? I know there is, but halachically between weaving and knitting.
So let's see. I indicated that there may be, but let's see.
Okay.
Certainly, it's an entirely different technique. So by definition, or it's going to have a distinction. But we'll see.
Okay. All right.
Thank you for asking.
Okay.
So again, Machlokas, Rabbi Elazar says weaving is either to start off, you need to have more, it's 3, but otherwise 1 string is significant enough. The Chachamim say no, 2 is a universal number for the purpose of weaving. Now is the part that for me is going to get a little more complicated. The Mishnah continues. Okay, now I'm sorry, it's not really complicated. Just I don't have experience with weaving, so I always felt uncomfortable with this Mishnah. A person makes 2, and use Rabbi Steinsaltz's words, these must be the professional language of professional weavers. If a person sets or makes 2 meshes, Rabbi Steinsaltz helps us out, ties the thread of the warp, attaching them either to the nirin or to the kiros, which the Gemara is going to explain. So if you attach 2 meshes, or you create 2 meshes, which again is talking about what I've been calling the vertical. If you attach the vertical strings, which are in the contraption that causes the threads to go back and forth, affecting the garment to be woven, 1 is chayiv. Now let's see, the Mishnah continues, and we'll see Rashi. B'nafa. B'nafa b'chabara uvasal. If you're using this in the creation of a winnow, a sieve, and a basket, which to my knowledge, which is limited, are all produced and created in a woven nature. Different functions, different thicknesses, different material, but it's all essentially a principle of weaving. Chayiv, 1 is chayiv. Ve'atofer shtei tfirot. What about 2 stitches of sewing? Ve'akorei al menat litfor shtei tfirot. And similarly, if a person is koreya, a person tears open or apart to create enough space to now be able to introduce 2 stitches. And the Gemara is going to discuss why you would ever want to tear in order to restitch. Why don't you just leave it? If it isn't broken, why don't fix it? But suffice it to say, we are now defining additional malachas, the malacha of tearing. The malacha of stitching, the malacha of tearing, which they too have the same formula, the magic number 2. So this mission, in a sense, has introduced to us a series of malachas, weaving. And in weaving itself, there's 2 components. There's setting the horizontal threads, there's weaving the vertical threads, and then there is stitching and tearing. And all of them, with the exception of Rabbi Elazar, the magic number is the number 2. 2 is substantive, 2 is malacha, 2 is you've effected a creative change, and therefore 1 is chayiv, and thus prohibited to do so on Shabbos. Beryl,
Rabbi,
yes.
I find it very hard to understand how this good could be bishgaga. I mean, to sew, you need a needle.
Beryl, what? Hold on, please help me for a moment. What is bishkaga? How have we been defining bishkaga?
Intention. I mean, this is not
What has been our common refrain? How does a person not know? What don't they know? So we've been frequently saying that he didn't realize it was Shabbos. And so that's how it could be bishkaga. You wake up, and especially if you're a professional weaver, you can do this in your sleep. It's like a chemist.
That's another question. If you do it in your sleep, what happens?
It's like, well, practically in your sleep. It's like a pharmacist who's really good at his malach and compounding is in his blood. He could wake up in the middle of the night and you say, I need you to compound the X, Y, and Z. Again, and he can whip it together. But you'll take anyone else on this group that's not a pharmacist, and we wouldn't even know where to start. And so professionals can plausibly do something. How do you call it? So anyways, it could happen.
Requires planning. All this requires planning.
Well, not if you have a workstation where you have all your weaving all set up, right? So
The issue is not if he planned the work or not. The issue is, did he forget if it's Shabbos or not?
Correct. So again, I'm gonna beg, or gonna claim absolute ignorance about weaving, but apparently there are two, we might call it odds and evens. There are the strings that in this case are taut, and then there are strings that are elevated and lowered. And so what you have is you have alternating strings on the vertical line, one that's stretched tight, and then one that goes through a loop that's elevated and lowered, causing the strings to crisscross in the manner necessary to have a woven garment. I don't know if I'm making myself clear, but you understand how you would want to have strings that will be rapidly going up and down to thread essentially the strings in between them. Because what happens is you'll introduce one row going one way, and then you'll want to have the next row going the opposite way. Again, there's probably more artful ways to describe this, but so you'll have the original horizontal strings stretched here, and then you'll have the odds or the evens thread through these eyes, thus facilitating the woven nature, which isn't very well illustrated in this first picture. It looks to me like a mistake, actually. But let's go over here. You see how it goes up and down? So in order to affect the woven nature, you need to have a mechanism that facilitates it, and that's what the loom does. And so the batei nirim are these eyes, these holes where the odd threads or the even threads, the other threads are woven, and so they can go up and then go down, making it easy to thread the strings through. And I think this part of the illustration is hopefully helpful to understand how the weaving goes. So again, this brown box with the holes is attached to a broader mechanism which allows it to go up and down. And when it goes up, it pulls the red strings up, allowing the thread to go under the red strings. And then when you pull it down, in a sense, you're having the green string be on top and the red string below, affecting a proper threading. So the weaving is, one more time, the threading of the yellow string. Setting the batei nirim, this is the red string, and the green string is what we might call the, how do you call it? Anyways, the stationary string in this illustration. So I hope that makes it clear enough. And that is essentially what our Mishnah is talking about. Any comments, questions, or clarifying explanations, folks? Anyone? Tosfos makes one little interesting point. Tosfos says, by the way, in our opinion, usually it is two. There might be one exception, which would be the very last string. If you recall, we spoke about the final letter and the significance. So Tosfos says the final string may also have that kind of same importance, and so let's not overlook that. Now let's start actually one more moment. Because the Gemara says, Bein Batchila, Bein Besoif. And Taisa says, we don't mean Besoif, the very end. We mean when you're into the job. Now let's see the Gemara. Kiyasa Rav Yitzchak Tani. Rav Yitzchak arrived to Babel from Eretz Yisrael. He taught as follows. He taught Shtayim. He taught the Brisa to teach that Rabbi Elazar says that you're chayiv for 2 strings. Rashi, Masni Hachir, Rabbi Elazar Aimer Ha'areg Beis Chotim Atchila, V'loi Polig Rabbi Elazar Ella Ba'echad Al Ha'areg. Rabbi Yitzchak had a different version of our Mishnah. He said that the only numbers in this conversation are 2 and 1. Erase number 3. What's number 3? It's what Rabbi Elazar says, Shloisha Chutim Batchila, to start off with 3 strings. And Rabbi Yitzchak had a version in Eretz Yisrael that says Shtayim, 2. The Gemara says, Vanan, Tanan, Shalosh, that's a problem, because our Mishnah says 3. Or let me explain this possibly. It's possible Rabbi Yitzchak didn't have a different version of the Mishnah. He had a different text that preserved the same achlokes differently. He had a brisa, let's say, that recorded that Rabbi Elazar only had 2 strings. So the Gemara asks, but we know our Mishnah says 3. So what's going on? Help us make sense. Help us make sense of this. Like Kasha, the Gemara says, it's not really a problem. The reason why there are 2 versions of Rabbi Elazar's teaching is because he was describing 2 different circumstances of weaving. Habe alimi, habe katini. The reason why there are different versions is because there are different circumstances of weaving. Rabbi Elazar in the Brisa is talking about alimi, very, very strong, thick threads. Habe katini, whereas our Mishnah is talking about much finer threads. When do you consider a garment secure and well established? So I suspect we can actually explain this 2 different ways. But let's see. Oh, the distinction is if the threads are thick, the threads are thin, the threads are strong, the threads are weak. Now, which is the Mishnah talking about 3 strings because they are weak, or 3 strings because they are strong? Is anyone with me?
Yeah.
Okay, shkach. But Amrila, so here. Well, let's stop here. Help me out. What would be the reason to that there would be a distinction between finer threads, weaker threads, and thicker threads? Anyone want to throw out a theory? Why would we distinguish? Why would Rabbi Elazar distinguish between thick and thin?
The weaker thread could be because it's less permanent. There's something about permanence.
So you're saying weaker threads are so soft that it can easily be broken, so we don't look at it as permanent. Whereas even 2 threads that are stronger, what would you say? We're already afagaing. The garment has already begun, right?
Yeah.
But you could also say an opposite case. Why? The finer the threads are, the easier and more seamless they interlock. Whereas the coarser the threads are, the less cohesive they are. Does that sound reasonable?
Yeah.
Or there's more of an open weave.
There's more, right? So the weave can fall apart with greater ease. I think maybe that's the 2 ways that I might understand this. So I think this is what the Gemara is saying. Amri la lahai gisa. Some explain that the Mishnah, which says 3, is talking about finer strands. The Amri la lahai gisa, and others say the Mishnah is talking about the thicker strands, because you could rationalize it in 2 directions. Amri la lahai gisa, those who say it like this: alimi telaso loisasri trei sasri. The thicker string, 3, they won't come apart. 2, they can come apart. Katini, but when it's very small, trei nami loisasri, because they're so fine, they're less likely to come apart. But Amri la lahai gisa, others explain it more so. Katini tlasa yadi trela yadi. If they're very fine, 2 strings are almost non-invisible. 3 is more visible. Alimi treinami yadi. But when they are stronger, they're thicker, they're more coarse, it's more visible. And so we have an answer, but we can reason it in 2 directions. Rashi lahai gisa alimi gimel v'lay beis mishum deshnayim sasir d'mitoich avyon einon nedakim yafa. So and Mark, and really everyone, this is exactly what we said. Mitoich avyon, when they're very thick, einon nidbakim yafa, they don't really adhere, they don't really fit together. V'katini b'shnayim echayim, but when they're 2, they fit together. So that's why I think we're not really talking exclusively about size, about strength. We're talking about coarse or fine. So the question is to be considered the beginning of a process. What's more important? The reality of how firm they are or the visual aspect? And this is a very interesting question. What's more important, reality or perceived reality? The matter of fact that the strings are stuck together, but we cannot see them, or the fact that we can see them, but they're not super fused.
Perceived.
So the doctor says perception is important, and it follows your shita that kavana is
exactly based on perception. Perception is reality.
Perception is reality. So even if reality is not in perfect sync with perception, perception essentially is the reality within which we work. Now I want to go on a total tangent, but it's a halachic debate that maybe supports your perspective. There's a question about halacha and things that are not visible to the eye. So for example, there's a famous question about insects or other items that are invisible to the naked eye, but under a microscope you can see them. Is one mandated to search even for that which is microscopic? And the fact of the matter is, without getting into, there's this area of application where you're going to argue. Don't scream at me. Hold on. So you have to search your lettuce for bugs and your strawberries for bugs. But if it is microscopic, you don't need to necessarily put it under a microscope. Similarly, and don't strangle me. Similarly, water that has microbiotic, and all water has microbiotic organisms, and the air too, right? There are mites and other things that we can absolutely not see, but absolutely exist. Halacha tells us you follow your eyes, not what a microscope can uncover. So this is a strong case to say that halacha says follow what you see, not reality. Now, just as an asterisk or a footnote to the footnote, because in New York,
Rabbi,
yes,
there is no such thing as an objective reality that an eye perceives, because different people have different visual acuity, and some of this acuity can be helped by using glasses or whatever, but other cannot. So what one person perceives by a clear eye might be hidden from another person.
Professor, I have a feeling.
So the question is what this person is to do.
So Professor, actually, I'm going to ask you, do you know which conversation this is reminding me about? This is reminding me about our question of halachic measurements. And today there's an attempt to really make sure that everything should be very streamlined and universal and uniform. But I suspect that and again, this is not halacha l'maisa. I'm not telling anyone about the laws of kosher or practically how to behave. But I suspect originally and in the raw form, every person has to inspect for anything that their vision, assuming that they have functioning vision, and that's essentially what halacha covers. Now, I just want to add a footnote. So I didn't elaborate at length, but do you agree with me that that's very reminiscent of that conversation in which every person kind of has their own, each person is individually tasked to use their judgment and their way of measuring and their ability to see. again, today, halacha l'maisa, there may be distinctions, but this is just a halachic aspect that supports Dr. Hammer's assertion that it's really perception that is the halachic reality. And there is a debate about the water in the tri-state area, or New York in particular, where they discover that there were microorganisms in the water, and then many people said you cannot drink it, and others said you can drink it and you have to filter it. I'm not taking a halachic position. Many Rabbanim say you do have to filter it. Others said no. Those who say you do need to filter it did not say that you have to be wary of everything that is invisible. They claim that these insects are essentially visible to the eye, but the chemicals in the water then cause them to be less visible. So because of that, they say that because in their raw form you could see them, so therefore you have to be mindful. I'm way oversimplifying a very complex issue, but I just wanted to put it there. So this is a very important question about perception versus reality, or what your eye can see versus what you cannot see. This also has bearings on some of the questions of where science and halacha seem to have a different viewpoint. But halacha doesn't always tell you need to study the absolute science, because again, you could use a microscope and discover things. Halacha tells you that you're halachically charged to use all of the resources that are readily available to you, and a person does not have to bring every item of food into a lab in order to eat them, etc., etc. When it comes to certain dimensions and measurements as well, a person isn't expected to use professional grade, laboratory grade equipment, as long as the tefillin looks and is properly square, etc. That in many circumstances would be sufficient. Again, this is not halacha l'maisa. This is just on the idea of perception versus reality. Yet we might make the case that our Gemara hasn't settled that, and so we could understand the Mishnah two ways. Maybe Rabbi Lazar says 3 is what's enduring. What's visible versus enduring, and we're going to have to leave this with a question mark. Reb Beryl, yes.
So back to what we're doing here. To one person, a thin thread is thick, and to another person, it depends if you're making things.
That's not what I was saying.
Thick and what's thin?
No. We're complicating things. All we're saying is like this: there's a Bryce and a Mishnah. At least the Art Scroll explains it that there's a Bryce and a Mishnah. Others, I think, explain that Rabbi Yitzchak had a different version of the Mishnah. And so the question is, how do you have two different editions? Rabbi Lazar, can he contradict himself? And the answer is no. He's talking about two different scenarios: thicker and thinner. Beryl, you're asking a good question. What's the measure of thicker and what's the measure of thinner? But let's put that on pause. I don't know. But let's understand first generally why you would differentiate between thick and thin. And so the Gemara has two opposite ways to understand it. And I think it's a very interesting mental exercise to see how the Talmud understands it. And I gave a theory, which is not such a deep theory, which is maybe the distinction is about perception. The Gemara says, is it what you see, or is it the reality of the cohesiveness of the strings? And that that's an interesting little section of Gemara. Yes.
I have a bit of information for you.
Please.
First of all, many years ago, we were in Egypt, and we saw them making various garments and mats from looms.
Okay.
And they have big looms for the mats, for the bigger, for the larger pieces of cloth or wool. And then they had finer ones, which were smaller looms that took up all the threads.
Was it the Egyptian linen products?
Yeah, it was that. But we bought a photo, not a photo, we bought a mat with the Egyptian calendar engraved on it.
And you bought a papyrus, right? And you also had a papyrus?
That's what it was. And it was made on a loom. And another thing is about the organism.
So hold on. So Alan, so you're saying, as a matter of fact, even to this day, there are different size looms and different grades of the fineness of threads. And
sure.
Okay, beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. Now to the microorganisms.
The reason you don't see them is because you don't want to see them. They're like little monsters.
Yeah.
the air is full of dust mites and
Right.
and dead skin cells and everything else. And even our eyes are filled with worms that keep the eyelids lubricated. You don't want to see those things. They're so ugly.
As they
They're
say,
scary.
what you don't know doesn't hurt you. Just try not to think too much about
That's for sure. That's for sure.
it. Thank you, Alan. Thank you so much for sharing your professional perspectives. I appreciate that. Although no thank you for making me think about those mites. I'd rather not think about them, but
You can Google them if you want.
All right, let's see a brisa that further discusses our subject here of weaving. And I just want to, because I know I projected a personal sentiment of discomfort around the topic of weaving. So first, I hope it's not contagious. And this is indeed, as you'll notice, a fascinating Gemara nonetheless. And also, it's going to be a short discussion. So even if you do share my aversion to weaving, we'll be through this in a few minutes. So Tanya, a brisa that teaches as follows on the subject of weaving. If one weaves three, as I described them based on the picture, three horizontal strings in the beginning of the loom, in the beginning of the weaving process, or one in a previously started weaving session. One is chayiv. This is, again, the opinion that we read of Rabbi Elazar. 3 and then 1. That we saw in our Mishnah. The Chachamim say no. Bein batchila, bein b'soif. Rather, it's the beginning of the process, or, deep into the process. Shi'oran shnei chutim. The prohibition of weaving on Shabbos, the measure, the shiur, to be considered to have woven is 2 threads. Ubisafa. What about a hem? What about the edge of a garment? So on the edge, let's see. Shnei chutim, roichav, shloisha batei nirim. 2 threads that are the width of 3 heddle eyes, or 3 meshes, 3 threads of the opposite direction. Let's just go back to our picture for a moment. The literal word we're describing here, batei nirim, is, I believe, this hole, if I'm not mistaken. But what we mean is the threads that go across. So for a hem, it's going to be 2 threads that are at least the width of 3 of these eyes, or these meshes, or Steinsaltz, 3 threads of the warp, 3 threads running the opposite direction. Let's read Rashi really fast. Yesh she'orgim saviv habeged. There are those who, when it comes to the edge of the garment, well, let's think about it. You weave the garment, you're going to essentially have a bunch of loose threads. And so, yesh orgim saviv hasafa ba'orech habeged kulo min acher. There are those, and this is, I think, our common practice. Look at any of the clothing you're wearing. Well, most of our clothing, I think, is stitched, but suffice it to say, somehow they figure out a way so that there are no loose threads hanging out. At least that's for most of our garments. The reason why we don't see it, I think, is a lot of times it's folded in and stitched, but whatever. If you would open up a garment and you'll see the edge, you might notice indeed that it is loose. So the technology may have changed. But there are those who create around the edge in a different manner, which is much more narrow. It's not the full length of the garment. It's all along the edge. And the dimensions, the size, the thickness is the size of the 3 wide strings. And so stitching, or really weaving, only 2 strings in this manner, you're chayiv. Let's see if our illustrator provides us. No illustration for this. Halama zedaima. How can we envision what this looks like? Le'oireg silsil katan. It's like if a person weaves a very small Here he says belt, or a very small belt. A small belt has small dimensions. So imagine that there's a small, thin belt all around the periphery, the corners of your garments. What about, I'm sorry, and the dimensions are of this small belt, 2 strings with a thickness of 3 cross strings.
Rabbi.
Yes, hold on, yes?
Why don't we just call this Makeh B'Patish? You're finishing something.
Do you remember yesterday's Gemara? That's why or 2 days ago, that's why we don't call Makeh B'Patish. Because Makeh B'Patish may be a different step of the process. But just doing the final string is not necessarily Makeh B'Patish. Actually, I hear your question. You're saying maybe adding the edge is like a finishing step. Okay, good question. For whatever reason, the Gemara does not perceive this to be Makeh B'Patish. But actually, your question makes more sense than I originally gave you. Hello. Welcome. Yes. How are you? Sholmer, you'll help. All right. So the Gemara continues. The Gemara continues with an analysis. Let's read. Yes. The Oireg Shloisha Chutim Batchila. Our Mishnah, or rather our Brisa that we just read, states that you have 3 strings, ve'echad al-org chayiv, and so the Gemara observes Stama Kirabi Eliezer. This Brisa, the anonymous or the assumed, welcome to town. How long are you here for?
We've been here the whole week.
Okay, very.
We'll be back very soon.
Very good. Everything good?
Everything's good.
Good to see you. Thank you.
New Jersey. It's sunny here. It's good.
So Stama Kirabi Eliezer. The anonymous default of this Mishnah is identical to Rabbi Elazar. All right, or Eliezer, I should say. Now let's talk a little bit more about weaving. Tanya Idach, there's another Bryce on the subject. It says, if you thread 2 threads onto gas, a large fabric, the al ha'imra, and on the border of the fabric, perhaps as we described in the previous price. Rabbi Elazar says for this weaving, one is chayiv, even 1 thread, which is consistent with Rabbi Elazar saying that if you're in the middle of a garment, even 1 thread is a problem. Rabbi Elazar says, but what about the edge? The edge, which Rabbi Beryl wisely asked, although I don't know if we're going to give you an answer, why it's not Makeh B'Patish, maybe because it's actually part of the whole process. So on the edge, when it comes to the edge, and we give an identical dimension to our previous brisa, 2 threads along the width of 3 strings. Halama is a doime. What is this akin to? Exactly what we said. It's like a belt. The statement, the assertion that you're chayiv for 2 strings, this brisa has a default to go in the viewpoint, to follow the viewpoint of the chachamim, which I guess we're saying really is there's 2 brisas. One brisa seems to embrace halachically the more stringent viewpoint of Rabbi Eliezer, and the other seems to, actually I should take that back. They're not strict and stringent. One is more on a sliding scale and one is more etched in stone. One brisa seems to take the preference of Rabbi Eliezer. The other brisa takes the preference of Rabbanan. What does that mean for us halachically? I'm not sure. Give me a second. All right, let's assume for now it's mostly academic. Hold on, let's do one more thing. All right, we'll do this soon. Let's continue the Gemara. Any comments? Any questions? Any thoughts? If one makes 2 meshes, again, just to remind you, we're talking about threading the string that's going to be flexible, fluid, moving up and down. So we said in the Mishnah, if you do two of them, you are
If you do the
chayiv.
other- You're not chayiv then? Just the
I'm
ones
sorry?
going straight? You do two strings of the ones that aren't going through the eyelets. You're not chayiv? You're the green ones.
You're saying if you only do the green ones, are you not chayiv? I don't think we're saying that you're not chayiv, but I think we're describing, this is a specific melacha, which seems to be different than weaving. But it's a good question. Again, as I told you, weaving is to date, my least previously familiar subject. But it seems like two already is enough to be considered a beged, or not a beged, considered weaving. And again,
Yeah.
making the
You're not
batinir.
starting to get the one going the other way.
I'm sorry.
You don't really start having the real weave until you have the ones going the
Right. You
cross.
need to have, you're saying two on their own is going to be unhelpful. You need to have the additional two. So that's a good question. It's a question we need to figure out, but I don't know at this very moment. So again, here's the picture and you're.
How this relate with, when you're a kid playing with a bunch of rubber bands, could you be considering almost doing a malacha? Putting a couple rubber bands on your.
So forget the rubber bands. What's the game?
Oh, the game with the string, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
You know how
cradle, cradle, what is it called? Something cradle.
Betalach in Yiddish.
And then,
Yeah. Could that be considered?
I know as a kid we played that on Shabbos without even thinking about it. It's one,
But it's not permanent. It's not permanent.
it's also one complete string. It's not separate strings,
All right. You see, you never know what's going to come up in this year. Our Mishnah says if you make these two meshes and either you attach them to the nirin or to the keros, my benirayim. What is a nirayim? Give me a definition. Archko calls them heddles. Rabbi Steinsaltz calls them meshes. Well, let's see. Amar Rabbi. Tarti bivasnira v'chada benira. Let's read the Rabbi Steinsaltz. What is the meaning? Rabbi says one ties two to the meshes and one to the crosspiece. So Mark, now we have your answer. The crosspiece is the green strings that are steady, I believe. And the batenirim are the ones that are flexible. And so right now we haven't exactly, right now we're giving definitions. We're not talking halacha. So basnira is the string that goes to the hole, and the nira is apparently the solidly stretched items. I may be wrong. So hold on 1 second. Let's read some more translations here. No. Hold on. Rashi. Beis pamim markiv lechut shel shesi vasnira. See the
Rabbi,
yes.
once we're going off on a tangent,
What's the tangent?
if a person is
Hold on. What's the tangent?
if a person is buying a thing that was woven, does
Yes.
he have to worry that they might have done it during Shabbos when he buys it?
This is a general question of how much research does a person need to do into an item that they're going to benefit to avoid it being done on Shabbos. Good question. It's going to be discussed, but it's not this moment. Generally speaking, you buy something in the shuk or the market, you don't have to be suspicious of its origin. If you have a specific reason to suspect, for example, if something is produced in a specific kibbutz that doesn't keep Shabbos, that's a good question.
Similar to
I
the
think
question of
that there is a rule that an item made illegally during Shabbos becomes kosher after a time period after the end of Shabbos.
The
It is
phrase
required to make the item.
the phrase is b'chtei sheyasu. The question becomes, however, that's if it was done neutrally or if it was done by a Gentile. There's a whole section of halacha that discusses if it was done intentionally, there are certain penalties that are conferred on the offender, and there are additional restrictions to a consumer. And many times we wouldn't really penalize the consumer, but we might advise not to use it. So that's why I want to leave it just a little open-ended. But you're correct, Professor. Certainly something that's done unintentionally, or if a Gentile does something for a Jew, generally speaking, we do say b'chdei sheyas, the time that it would take to achieve it after Shabbos would be sufficient. But it's not quite so simple. But thank you for
similar to the microscope question, to what level?
Yeah. But now we need to go back to understanding this story here. And hold on.
Earl,
Yeah.
you could, the problem is don't buy it on Shabbos.
All right.
No, don't pay for it on Shabbos.
So I'm getting mixed messages about this example. Suffice it to say, we're describing something about how the strings are attached or affixed in the mechanism. But again, I can confess here and now, I'm not certain what we're talking about. The kairos, we said in the Mishnah also, if you attach the string to the kairos, what is that? And reading Rabbi Steindl here doesn't help me either. I think there are actually different opinions, different interpretations, major different understandings of this very line. So
I made the strong one.
My bekeros, what is the word bekeros? Amarav mitzuvita. It is a mitzuvita, not a Mitsubishi. A mitzubita is, let's see, the slips, the part that goes up and down on a stationary loom and are parallel to the pole. Okay, that we can figure out. This is the matsuvisa. So there we have it. The magic number on Shabbos, as you see and continues to be, is the number 2. This number, it can be extended, at least according to the Chachamim, to the realm of weaving and beyond. To me, the interesting part of this Gemara was the discussion or understanding the 2 versions of Rabbi Elazar, whether it was 3 or 2, and the way we said that it may depend upon the type of string being used, and it gave us the opportunity again to consider perception versus reality, if you will. It allowed us to consider how many times we can consider a unspecified distinction in 2 ways, and that was part of the exercise that the Talmud gifted us. Now let's do another few lines and we'll call it a day. Hatofer shtei tfirot. Stitching 2 stitches. Gemara says, hold on a second. We already know this fact. It's in this Mishnah I showed you before, explicitly. And so why do we need to elaborate this detail again? Rashi explains. Why do we need to mention it here? The Mishnah, our Mishnah, added no additional data, no additional facts. So we essentially repeated the very same line with all the information that we already know. I'm sorry. When it came to weaving, there is additional data which made its mention relevant. But for this, our question is, why is it being mentioned? So the Gemara says, you know why we talk about stitching, even though there is no added information? Because there is a form, the next part of the Mishnah has to go too. About the tearing part. And the tearing part is constructive, does have additional information. So therefore, tearing and stitching in the purposes of Shabbos are 2 sides of a coin. And so for the common formula of the Mishnah, it always makes sense to mention them in conjunction with one another. So the Gemara says, hold on. The Hakareya Nami Hatanena Ba'avis Malachais. In truth, tearing was also listed in the same Mishnah. We have to teach us the next Mishnah. The next Mishnah tells us a special law about a person who tears not to constructive purposes, but out of anguish. Therefore, we have to introduce again the law of tearing. And to introduce the law of tearing, we mention the law of stitching. And so essentially, our Gemara is asserting that this is almost all for the form and style, but doesn't necessarily contribute additional halachic facts to our case. On Monday with Hashem's help, we'll resume. Again, this Sunday's again a little complicated, but Monday we'll resume, and we'll end off with a few lines talking about tearing, and then we'll move on to the next Mishnah, which is going to talk about very interesting additional subjects, and we'll get back to our regular, what's the word? Get back on track over here. I want to thank you all for joining us. Another day, another journey through the Talmud. Today we get to learn about weaving, and we pray once again for health and good circumstances for all of Klal Yisrael, the members of our Chabura, and we'll especially pray and hopefully add in mitzvahs for the merit of the hundreds of thousands of Jews and innocent civilians more broadly that are currently living in great fear and in real tangible threat for harm. Hashem should protect them. And let's pray that this conflict and this crazy story should indeed be an event that heralds in the truest sense of world peace with the arrival of Mashiach. The world can certainly use a big dose of good news, and that would count, that would qualify, and let it be so. My dear friends, have a wonderful Shabbos, and thank you so much.
I just want to add something.
Yes.
Thank you.
We were talking about acronyms yesterday.
Yes.
And it just clicked. Where's an acronym in the Siddur? And as I was doing Mincha, there it is, right at the beginning.
Where? Ana B'koach?
Ana B'koach Gedulas.
Yes. And it's
then
actually,
you look to the left.
Even more interestingly, the Ana B'koach over there is actually constructed for the acronyms. The acronyms have to do with different angelic stuff that's a little bit beyond my pay grade. And the Ana B'koach was formulated so we could channel it and reference it without saying it explicitly, because generally, besides for certain famous angels like Gabriel and Michael and the like, we don't say the names of angels, which of course also leads me to mention our dear Gabriel from the shul, who's the cheerleader and the gabbai, the weekday gabbai. So unfortunately, his father passed away, and so next week after the funeral, we'll be dedicating our learning for his father, and we should only have good news to share in the community. And that's that. Thank you all. Shalom Chumash. We're going to end the link, and you're invited to rejoin to study Chumash. Thank you.
Shalom.
Shalom.